Hey guys, I'm out today. I'm going to put a minute up on the board. That should give you time to get your homework out and get your daily question sheet. We'll do the daily question or the objective first, and then I'll go over the homework. So get ready. All right, let's start out talking about the answers for the homework. So number one asks you to define or to describe some density independent and density dependent factors for deer living in Minnesota. So for density dependent, the obvious ones, of course, are food, especially in the wintertime. That's when deer, when food and the availability of food really affects deer in Minnesota. Um, Obviously, predators like coyotes and humans. The more deer there are, the bigger the density there are, they're actually more likely that a single deer is going to survive. Also, habitat or cover trees. The more deer there are, the fewer are going to be able to find a place to kind of hunker down territory-wise. And then probably disease, too. There's certain diseases. Big one that you hear in deer, of course, is chronic wasting disease. But diseases are going to spread more based on those density-dependent factors, the fact that there's more deer around. Independent factors, the main independent factor, of course, is going to be the cold weather in the wintertime. That's kind of the main thing that we would think affecting deer. And you may have some other things there, but just remember that density-dependent is going to change based on the number of deer there are in the population, whereas density independent, it isn't going to matter. Natural disasters would be, any of those would be another one that you could put under density independent. Okay, for number two, this graph shows a curve for a population growing without limit. It's an exponential growth. It doubles and doubles. There's nothing to stop it. It's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. Number three shows a population growth curve where a population is going to grow towards a carrying capacity. So here, as the organisms get closer to that carrying capacity, the total number of organisms that can actually fit into the environment, the line is going to flatten out because there's going to be there's many organisms dying as there are being born. And we're going to get kind of an equilibrium there. One thing that we didn't really talk about yesterday that hopefully you guys understand is that based on the environment, that carrying capacity can change. If it's a really good year, maybe there's a higher carrying capacity and the more organisms can fit in. If it's a really bad year, maybe that carrying capacity is down. If there's more predators, maybe that carrying capacity is down. So that carrying capacity is not necessarily set. It can move along as well. But we're kind of looking at how the population fits in based on a carrying capacity. And then finally, here we have to draw a population growth curve for a population going over the carrying capacity. So yesterday we talked about the R-type strategists that are going to go and blast by. And so you can draw something like this, you know, or maybe it's more gradual, something like this, and then come down, whatever. But after it goes past the carrying capacity, we know it's going to crash because there's going to be more organisms that are alive than the environment can actually hold. So there's going to be a lot of death that happens and a lot of organisms that don't survive. Okay, and go back and look at your graphs. Remember, we need to make sure we label each axis so that we know what's going on there. Okay, today we're going to talk about something called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So, Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, we'll write it out here. This was actually created by a couple of mathematicians, not biologists. These are mathematicians that were applying mathematics to the idea of natural selection and evolution, and specifically looking at gene frequencies. So I kind of have to talk about that. And it's named after Hardy and Weinberg. There should actually probably be a dash in between there because they were two different mathematicians that set forth these things in pretty much exactly the same way at independent times. So they didn't work together. They came up with the idea independent of each other. It was the same thing. So we named it after both of them. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium looks at gene frequencies. So for our examples today, we're going to be looking at a population of rabbits. In that population of rabbits, we have two different phenotypes. So remember, phenotype is how the organism actually looks. We have brown rabbits and we have white rabbits. This is in our example here, this is going to be a perfectly dominant and recessive relationship. Brown rabbits are going to have at least one brown gene, so we'll call that big B. White rabbits, of course, have to be because it's recessive, have to be homozygous for that recessive gene. So they will always have two little b genes, little b alleles. So brown rabbits can be homozygous dominant or they can be heterozygous. White rabbits always have to be homozygous recessive. If we were to look at this population and count up how many of the big B alleles and the little b alleles there are, what we would find is that there is a certain percentage. So to give you kind of an idea, I'm going to go through and label each of these rabbits with their genotype. So you can see here, I've labeled the genotypes of every rabbit. Some rabbits, brown rabbits like this one, are going to be homozygous dominant. Some brown rabbits like this one are going to be heterozygous. They both look brown because they have that one dominant allele. But we can see the genotypes of all these different organisms, the two alleles that they actually carry. Of course, all the white rabbits have to be homozygous recessive. Now what we want to do is look at how many of each allele there are. So what we're going to do is count up the big B's and the little b's and get a total number. So for example, in this rabbit right here, we have two big B's. So that would go in for the big B's, we would put a 2 there. For this rabbit right here, he's got one of each, so we would add to each one. And if we go through and add all of them up, we'd find that there are 10 big B alleles, 10 dominant alleles, and there are 16 recessive alleles. And then we would calculate a percentage. So if there's 10, so if there's 10 of the big B's and 16 of the little b's, that's 26 altogether, and we can find percentages. That would be 38% dominant allele. And if this is 38%, the other one would have to be 62%. So we would say in this population, 62% of the alleles are recessive, 38% are dominant. Now this, of course, relates, but it's not the same as the phenotypes. If we look at this, it's roughly, I mean, there's actually more brown rabbits than there are white rabbits, but some of those brown rabbits have one of each. So there's actually more recessive genes in this population. Now, what Hardy and Weinberg figured out mathematically is that if everything is random, if these rabbits are mating randomly and everything is random about their lives, then those percentages should not change from generation to generation. And we'll write that down in a minute, so don't get too worried about trying to figure out what to put down. But basically they're saying if these rabbits all have babies and we look at the next generation, then we should get pretty much 62% homozygous recessive, 62% recessive genes and 38% dominant genes. And that should occur from one generation to the next all the way down. That should not change unless there's something that is not random that is happening to this population. And we'll have to talk about what those things are. Okay? So, H double equilibrium basically says that the gene distribution, basically this is the percentage of alleles, should not change from generation to generation unless, and there's 5 different things that we're going to have to put down here that could change what's going on. So basically, I mean, the whole term Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium means staying the same. They're saying that a population, the mix of genes in a population should always stay the same unless one of these next things is happening. So we're going to list these things and then we'll go and talk about each of them. So the first one is mutations. Number 2 is gene flow. Number 3 is genetic drift. Number 4 is selective mating. This up a little bit here. And then number 5 is natural selection. Okay? So basically, these 5 things are the only things that can actually disrupt Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium and change a population. So we'll say change the percentage of alleles in a population. So let's go on and talk about each of these in turn and see how they can actually affect the change or the percentage of genes. Okay, so we talked about mutations before. We know that a mutation is just a change in the genetic code, and that can come by a few different ways. We talked about point mutations, how there can be a single gene that's added in another, or in a sequence somewhere that's changed somehow. We talked about deletions, how pieces can be taken out. There's translocations where things get swapped around. Basically, a mutation is something that happens in the actual chromosome to change the genetic code. So we should probably write that mutations change the genetic code. For example, in our rabbits, if we have the next generation of rabbits and they all grow up and suddenly we have a blue rabbit, that's obviously going to change the percentage of alleles out there, because now we have a whole new allele. We've got this blue thing that's shown up. It doesn't have anything to do with brown being dominant and white being recessive. It's a completely different thing. And because that changes the gene frequencies, this is going to change the population. So mutations change the gene frequencies by actually putting new alleles into the mix and making it so that the population is going to be different than it was before. So overall, mutations are pretty simple as far as how they affect Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. The percentage of alleles are going to change because there's new alleles being introduced. Okay, the next situation on our list is gene flow. Gene flow happens when organisms either move in or out of the population. Okay, this is kind of an extreme situation right here in this example, but let's say we have on one side of a mountain a population of birds that are blue. They've all got a dominant genotype, so they're all big H, big H. On the other side of the mountain are birds that are red. They all have the homozygous recessive phenotype. They live independently of each other. In a freak occurrence, these birds meet up, or two birds from each population meet up, and they are able to have some offspring, I guess, in each side of, or each population. That's going to change the gene frequencies because we have this gene flow from one population to another. So when organisms move in or out of the population, it's going to change the overall numbers of those alleles, and it's going to change those gene percentages, and that means that in the next generation, those gene percentages will be different because they're not contributing their genes in the same way as they would if they would have stayed in the population they originally started out at. So in our rabbit example, if we look at that, let's say these two brown rabbits here leave the population. They go somewhere else. That's going to reduce the number of genes in this population, and it's going to reduce the percentage-wise because of the genes that they take with them. If we look at the population overall after that, we were to calculate the percentages and the ratios, we would see that it is slightly different. It may not be a lot, but it is going to then change the population because those percentages have changed. So anytime, and we could imagine the same situation, we threw a whole bunch of extra white rabbits in here, that's going to change the population makeup as well. So anytime organisms are either leaving or coming in, taking their genes with them, that's going to change the population overall. Our next example is genetic drift. Genetic drift is something that happens with small populations. So in a small population, freak occurrences, just random events, can change allele frequencies significantly. And we should probably add that to our definition here. So you have a freak occurrence that changes allele frequencies significantly. In the example here, we've got somebody that steps on a bunch of bugs. Because he just happens to step on two green bugs, and not a green bug and a tan one, he has significantly changed the allele frequencies in this population, because overall there's not very many bugs to begin with and not very many green bugs in the population. So he's just reduced the number of green bugs and the number of alleles for those green bugs quite a bit just by stepping on those two. So genetic drift happens when you just have, freak events, landslide, those kind of things, those natural disasters, that kind of stuff. But it's going to affect small populations because it will affect the percentages when those organisms are removed quite a bit more. So, for example, with a rabbit population, if we have a rabbits distributed like this, and a truck comes by and kills off these rabbits right here, if we compare, we've removed 3 white rabbits and 1 brown rabbit from the population. That is very much going to change our gene distribution, our allele frequencies, because we've got a small population to begin with. We didn't have that many alleles. I think we only had 26 alleles altogether. So if we've removed now 3 rabbits, that's 4 rabbits, that's going to be 12 alleles that we've taken out of the population. If we have a much larger population, then taking 3 rabbits out isn't going to affect things that much, and it's not really going to change the population. So large populations don't really have to worry, or I guess they don't worry, but large populations are not affected by genetic drift as much, because removing a few individuals in a freak accident is not going to affect things. Okay, the next one we have is sexual selection, or sometimes we hear it called non-random mating. When Hardy and Weinberg first came up with Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, of course they did it independently, but it's all based on mathematics. It's all based on probability, really. Flips of a coin. And so for probability to work, everything has to be random. Everything has to be kind of fair, as they say. When you flip a coin, if you got 10 heads and 40 tails flipping it 50 times, you would think, well, there's something weird going on there. On average, we should get about 25 and 25. When we talk about probability in populations, what we're saying is when 2 rabbits meet up, there should be just as much of a chance of a brown rabbit mating with a white rabbit as there is with a brown rabbit and a brown rabbit. I mean, obviously, the sexes have to be separated, but as far as those color distributions, if mating is really random, then it shouldn't matter. Whatever rabbit gets with whatever rabbit is going to just depend on which one finds which one first. But in some cases, in a lot of organisms, we see sexual selection. Maybe the brown rabbits are more likely to mate with other brown rabbits. And if that is true, then that is going to change how those allele frequencies get passed on to the next generation. Because if brown rabbits kind of stick with brown rabbits and tend to not mate with white rabbits, then it's more likely that those brown genes are going to get passed on, and the allele frequencies are going to change. So when mates are choosy, when mates are going to select other organisms based on their traits, that can affect gene frequencies down the road. And so if there's sexual selection going on, then the population is not going to be in equilibrium. It's going to change from generation to generation. Okay, and then our final thing that can disrupt Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is natural selection. So if these rabbits existed in a environment where there was snow, the brown rabbits are going to stick out much better than the white rabbits. The white rabbits are going to be more camouflaged. The brown rabbits are probably going to be more likely to be eaten, and we have natural selection going on. The white rabbits are more likely to survive. That's going to change gene frequencies down the road, because the white we should expect to see, just like we did with the moss before in the forest, we should expect to see the ones that are able to hide, those numbers increasing over time because they're more likely to pass their genes on. And so natural selection will change allele frequencies. That's what this says here, changes in allele frequencies. because the environment is helping to determine which organisms are more likely to survive and which organisms are more likely to die off before they're able to pass their genes on. And just like sexual selection, that's going to affect the next population, the next generation. Okay, if we go back to our list, remember these things that we talked about, mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, selective mating, and natural selection, are all things that can change the makeup of a population from one generation to the next. If none of these things is happening, then the population will not change. Okay, but if we look at each of these, mutations are almost always happening. You can't stop mutations. They might not be mutations that lead to allele changes, but mutations are kind of always ongoing. So there's always a chance that your population is going to change because of mutations. Gene flow, maybe, maybe not. It's going to depend on the populations and whether or not there can be genes that come in or out. But just organisms that, for whatever reason, leave the population, that's going to contribute to gene flow. So that's something that is fairly likely to happen as well. Genetic drift, as we talked about, only really affects small populations. So that one's kind of the one that is least likely to be going on in a population. Selective mating, maybe, maybe not. It's going to depend on the species that we're talking about. Certain organisms are very selective. Certain organisms are not. Plants tend to be not as selective because how they get their seeds around. There are some exceptions to that. Animals tend to be more selective as far as choosing mates. But selective mating is something that happens in a lot of populations. But this is the big one. You pretty much can't get away from natural selection. There's always going to be some organisms that fit better into the environment and are more likely to pass their genes on. Even with humans nowadays, we keep coming back to humans and how we don't necessarily fit into all this stuff. And there's a lot of things like medicine and our food production and that kind of stuff that has made it so that natural selection doesn't play as much of a role, but there's still a selection that's going on. So you can't get away from natural selection, which basically means the population is always changing. Okay, whether it's from mutations or gene flow, selective mating, those things can happen. Natural selection is almost always happening. Because of these things, you're not going to see populations that don't really change unless it's in a laboratory environment. In labs, we have done experiments when we take away all of these things. Mutations, it's a little hard, but we can show over a few generations that mutations wouldn't make that much of a difference. But if we take away most of these things, we can show that the allele frequencies really don't change under experimental conditions. But in nature, it's hard not to be under at least one of those different things that's going to change a population. So the last thing we need to talk about is the actual definition of evolution. We've kind of talked about evolution. We've talked about some of the things and some of the evidences and all that kind of stuff. We haven't really nailed down a perfect description of what evolution is. Well, evolution, the way scientists define it, is basically just a change in populations from generation to generation. If you take one generation of organisms and you compare it to the previous generation and you see that the allele frequencies have changed, evolution has happened. It may not be huge, changes in evolution. You may not see obvious physical difference between the two organisms, but technically that's what evolution is. Over lots of generations, thousands, maybe even millions of generations, those small changes can add up to very big changes. We can get much different organisms and even new species that come out because of evolution. But at its most basic level, if the population changes, we would say that it is evolving. And hopefully, what we've seen through the Hardy-Weinberg stuff is that populations are basically always evolving. it's under strict laboratory conditions where we've taken those things away, those 5 things that we've talked about, then evolution is going to be happening. And so the last thing that we'll say here is that evolution happens when Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is disrupted. Okay, that's all there is for today. For tomorrow, do worksheet 14.2. I'll see you.